We are recording, we're live. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here at the Unprivileged Award Ceremony to celebrate the winners, the winner, and the people who participated in our photo contest. Now, my name is Anna Truzzi. I'm a researcher at Trinity College, and I'm also Secretary of Women in Research Ireland. And in the past few months, the Women in Research Ireland and Trinity College came together thanks to the Equality Fund to put up and develop this innovative project, Unprivileged, which from the start aimed to raise awareness about social inequalities. And what we wanted to do was try to capture how nuanced these social inequalities could be, and also how pervasive they could be without us even noticing. Which is the reason why in the photo contest, we asked our participants to try and capture with lenses the gap between the privilege and the disadvantage in society. But we did not give any further instruction or specify what, because we want to leave open interpretation to that. And the entries were actually very interesting, and the different photographer approached the task from different perspectives. So some of them, for example, tried to capture inequalities in the economy, or maybe in the gender gaps, or consequences of war, disability, immigration, environmental issues, health issues, and so on and so forth. And so we're happy to report that it was an international success. We had 59 entries from 10 different countries, so we're really happy. And as I said, everyone just approached this in a different way. So it was really interesting. And our judges panel was composed by professional photographer Mark Nixon, who's here tonight with us. So thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. And then also by WIRI member Kathy Corcoran, who's also here with us. Thank you, Katie. And by myself. And we had the thanks. And we had the honestly very hard task to shortlist and then decide the winner of the contest. But we managed, after a long discussion, a productive discussion, we set on a short list of 4 best picture, who I'm going to show you now. So we have them printed, but just in case, also the people in the audience, and we'll just go through them a second. Okay. So the first one was shot in Bangladesh by Oscar Ibn Firoz, and the title is Life in a Rice Mill. And here we can see that there are two children from the same family, a girl who's working and a boy who's playing at the same time. So they are from the same family, but they are given different tasks. One has to do chores, the other doesn't have to because of their different gender. And then we have Bed and Table, shot in Brazil by Rose Batistella. And here, Rose tried to capture the consequences, the hidden economic consequences of COVID-19, and how this can have a very long and harsh impact on the society, because, of course, who was already struggling economically, of course, was it harder. And therefore, this shows then in the cities of Sao Paulo. Now we have Fire Incident, shot by Kader Syed in Bangladesh again. This picture shows a burnt car, and the car was burned in a fire that was started because it was attributed to a illegal chemical warehouse bursting into flames. And this shows how in that area of the city, it's difficult to have a healthy environment, because this apparently happens often. And so they are not granted the right to a health environment. Whereas the last one, shot by Srimanta Ray. By the way, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. Beg your pardon. And the title of this photograph is called Imitation. And it shows a blind girl learning to read. And of course, some people, especially with disability, might have some special educational needs, which if are not met, then of course causes long-lasting inequalities in the life. So these were the shortlisted, and congratulations to them. But I want to thank personally, and on behalf of the organizer as well, every photographer that participated, because thanks to them, we could actually make this happen. And also thanks to them to actually take action in their everyday life to try and raise awareness of these differences. And I also, of course, want to thank all the members of WIRI, Women Research Ireland, for all their work and their support during both the fall contest and in organizing the ceremony here. And again, of course, the Equality Office, without which support we could not have done this project, without their financing and their ongoing support during the project as well. Okay, so moving forward, an important step in trying to better understand and take action against inequality in society is to understand them from the data. And for this purpose, I am honored to introduce you Professor Kat Chen, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology here at Trinity College Dublin. And she works on socioeconomic inequalities across the life course using international comparisons, longitudinal research, and quantitative methods. And she has a PhD in social policy from the University of Cork in UK, and came here to Trinity 3 years ago after working for the UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti in Florence, in Italy, where she led research projects on child poverty and child well-being in a cross-country comparative perspective. So join me in welcome Professor Chen, please. Thank you.
You have upgraded me by calling me a professor.
My pleasure.
Hey, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Oh, it's so lovely to be here. Thank you, Anna, and thanks everyone online and here in the room. So we all really want to know who the winner is, but until then, you're going to bear with me for about half an hour. And I'll talk about, well, mostly my own research and some stylized facts on one of the most pervasive types of inequalities that we have in rich countries in particular, but really all over the world for sure. And that is, of course, educational inequalities and the so-called socioeconomic gradient in children's educational outcomes. Or to put it more simply, why is it that children from more privileged families tend to do better in standardized tests, in the rates at which they graduate from high school and enter university, and then even the types of universities and the types of subjects they take up at a tertiary level? All of those things are strongly patterned by family socioeconomic status. So without further ado, so I'll just talk very briefly about how we actually can observe differences in children's educational outcomes by family background in rich countries, including in Ireland, and then I'll very briefly talk about some of the main theoretical models that help us understand why this happens, and also some recent evidence that would be informed by these theories. So a little bit of a framework, and I know that the lights are really harsh up there, so it may be difficult to see what's at the top of the slide, but this is quite a simple model of educational inequalities across the life course. So things start from even before a child is born. There are certain genetic differences already, and then there are the circumstances of the family during the gestational period, and all of that may have consequences for children's later outcomes in health and education. And then, you know, children progress through their early childhood. Eventually, they reach the preschool age. Many of them, but not all, enter some kind of center-based education and care settings before they start formal compulsory education. And then from that, of course, they proceed through primary and secondary school, and then either to further study or employment. So this is the child's kind of progression through as they age. And then on top of that, there are different levels at which these outcomes, or, you know, children's development can be influenced. And so from a certain age, of course, a child's own agency plays a role, the choices that make, which are of course determined by the environment, but there is always some choice. And then from at least primary school, children's peers may play a role, but it is the family and the circumstances and the resources that the family has that have a bearing on children's life chances and outcomes from the get-go, from the very start. Then when children start compulsory schooling, educational systems start playing an important role, particularly when you go to the transition from primary to secondary education. And countries vary a lot in the way that this transition happens and how many different tracks schooling systems offer and at what age, most importantly, children are sorted for the first time based on their measured or perceived academic aptitude or some form of ability. So we probably all know that in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, children are sorted into different tracks. Some of them are more academic, others more vocational, at the ages of 10 or 11. That is some of the earliest that we can see in Europe, while in Nordic countries and Baltic countries, this type of tracking does not start until the age of 16. In Ireland, it's 15, so reasonably late. So that plays a role. And of course, schooling systems have an influence on children's outcomes and the way that it may also interact with family circumstances in a way that, by and large, richer families tend to be able to send their children to better schools. That's not always the case, but there is a little bit of that in most countries. And now on top of that, of course, you have the prevailing economic environment of a given country, and of course its social and public policies. All of these different levels interact with each other. And now, while this is not in any way new to anyone, this shows that it is very complex to try to disentangle the different effects of these different levels at different points in a child's life. So it is in fact very difficult to say just how much of a role do schools play, just how much of a difference the different countries' educational systems play. And of course, if you do want to look at the effects of these higher levels, you do need to have data on several countries and to do international comparisons, because in one country at a point in time, policies and systems do not tend to vary enough to be able to do any meaningful analysis with that. So I'll just show you that, if you think about children's life course, you may not be able to see the graph, but it shows that across the European Union, in about half the countries, so many, but not all, there is a visible difference in the rates of preschool attendance by household income. So this compares those from the bottom 20th of the income distribution and the top 20th of the top fifth of the income distribution. So the bottom quintile and the top quintile, which is to say the bottom fifth and the top fifth. So the poorest and the richest, in a way, in many countries, including Ireland, those from the richest families are substantially more likely to be enrolled in center-based preschool education and care before they start compulsory schooling. And attending preschool for even a limited amount of time each week tends to be good for preparing children for primary school. Now, it's important that in many countries, there is no meaningful difference by household income. And so these are countries such as Belgium, Iceland, France, and Spain. So these are the countries that we can learn from, for example, in Ireland, because those are the countries that make preschool education affordable and accessible to everyone. Now, if we jump over towards the end of compulsory schooling, so this is age 15, and this data, again, you probably can't see the graph very well, but this comes from the standardized assessment of 15-year-olds in all of the OECD countries and several others. This is done by the OECD, and it's called Program in International Student Assessment. You probably would have heard of the PISA survey, happens every 3 years. And in every single participating country, at least within the OECD, you will always see a socioeconomic gradient in children's scores. So this is reading, but it's the same for mathematics and science. So even in the countries that have the smallest absolute gaps by, so here this is parental occupational class. So Iceland has the smallest gap by parental education in children's reading literacy scores. And even there, it's a gap of something like 30 points, which is small by international standards, but non-trivial. This is a meaningful difference. So some children are behind in reading, and they tend to be predominantly from lower socioeconomic status families. Now, in countries towards the top, towards the bottom of this ranking, these differences amount to more than 1 year of schooling, if you put it in years of schooling equivalent terms. So very large inequalities in what children can actually do at the age of 15. And reading is a fundamental skill that is a gateway to most other forms of learning. So this is very worrying. And even though these data are publicly available and tend to enter the news cycle every time a new PISA report comes out, we still probably don't appreciate enough just how substantial these inequalities are, including in countries like Ireland. Now, I'm getting towards the end of just showing you some facts. So this is just Ireland, and now Ireland has one of the highest rates of tertiary education among young people, 25 to 34, in the European Union. So about 60% of 25 to 34-year-old have a university degree. But the types of university that young people go to vary by these people's socioeconomic status. You may have seen this in the Irish Times and elsewhere, but it shows that institutions such as Trinity have a very large proportion of young people from more socioeconomically privileged areas. So this is all area level, kind of electoral ward and smaller, while those who are from more disadvantaged areas are severely underrepresented in institutions such as Trinity College Dublin. Okay, so how do we explain all that? We know, I can talk for hours about, hey, look at these inequalities here and there, but how do we make sense of these things? So in the social sciences, there are two dominant models or theories that help us explain these. One comes from psychology, and the family stress model has this very clear pattern of influence that goes from poverty or economic hardship at the top and ends up with children's outcomes, mostly mental health outcomes, but also it can be used for educational outcomes towards the bottom of this flow chart. So the way it works is that poverty or economic hardship is objectively a situation when a given family's resources or income is not sufficient to meet their expenses. It doesn't even have to be a low income family. It could be any family where they have a mismatch between their income and their expenses. Now that leads to economic pressure, which is more of a subjective construct whereby people experience they do not have enough money, and so they struggle to make ends meet. Now that is very stressful, and there is a large literature behind it that shows that the link between economic pressure and psychological distress is very strong. Anyone can imagine that not having enough money is incredibly stressful. It has profound mental health implications. Now, this is at the level of the parents. We're interested in inequalities among children, but this model focuses on parents and their mental health. Now, parents then start having problems within the family. So this is still just two parents arguing with each other, perhaps about money, perhaps anything else. And that leads to so-called disrupted parenting, where parents are not able to give enough warmth to their children, their arguments, and all of that then downstream results in poorer mental health outcomes for children and other adverse outcomes. Now, in my recent paper, I've taken this model and with my co-authors, we have argued that it's not quite right to only think about children as appendages to their parents, and children are actors and agents in their own right, particularly slightly older children, so at least from the age of 8. And so we used data on parent-children dyads, and I'll tell you more about the data in 1 minute, to try to see what happens if you enter children and their own perceptions of economic hardship and economic pressure and their own estimates of their psychological distress, and what would happen then, how would the model actually change. So we found that children's perceptions matter very much, and they are very much actors in their own right. But the data come from England, collected 4 years ago, summer 2018. It's representative at the level of the children aged 10 to 17, but of course not at the level of the parents. The majority of the parents were mothers. More than a quarter were in white-collar professions, that is the parents. About a third had a university degree, and children were, of course, equally split by gender and were on average about 13 years old. So there was a question, 10 questions about the sort of things that children tend to value, but that they either have access to or they don't. And if they don't, they may either really want that to have that thing, or they don't really mind. And so this is how we measure deprivation or economic hardship at the level of the children. And it is having pocket money, money for savings, day trips with their family and holidays with their family that have the highest deprivation rates. Well, things like clothes and shoes tend to have somewhat lower rates of children not having those things, but even so we have somewhere around 10% of children not having the right shoes, not having the right clothes. Then we have estimates of how people cope with not having enough money. Same questions are posed to parents and children, and it's things like pretending not to need something, going hungry, missing out on social activities. Parents tend to report these coping strategies at higher rates than children, which is consistent with evidence from England, primarily, that low-income parents do their best to shield their children, but at the same time, the children tend to understand what is going on, and often they try to protect their parents, for example, by not telling them that there is a school trip coming up that needs to be paid for. And then we use one of the standard measures of negative well-being or psychological distress for parents and children. And then our outcome measure is this type of dysfunction within the family, measured by the frequency of arguments about money between the parents or between children and parents. So in the end, we do show that children's perceptions matter very much. They do influence intra-family conflict. And so what this means, not just for the theory, but for policy, is that it's not very helpful to talk about poverty reduction in terms of primarily behavioral interventions. So, let's make people get on with each other, even if their lives are really, really difficult, but let's make sure they don't argue with each other about money when they don't have enough money. Instead, it may be a lot better to make sure that we actually have enough redistribution within the economy and the tax benefit system so that children and parents do not have to cope with not having enough money for what they need. So this basically helps us understand that what goes on within families matters, but it is more complex than we realized when we only focused on parents, and it is important to incorporate children in this as well. Now I'm going to so I'm going to wrap it up very soon. Now I really want to say a few words about another major theory. This one is more rooted in sociology and economics than psychology, but also helps us explain differences in children's education and health as well. So the more qualitative sociological approach to this is to argue that better off families actually deal with their children somewhat differently than those on lower incomes or in lower status occupation. So this is all about socialization, how you bring up your children. So it could be, on the one hand, concerted cultivation, where you structure your children's time, where you have plenty of enrichment activities for them, and you also teach them how to interact with institutions, which for children is primarily schools, teachers, how to argue for privileges and better treatment, and not take no for an answer. All of those things are inculcated in children from a young age, as opposed to the accomplishment of natural growth, where children are taught to defer to authority, including in schools, and their time is less structured. They have more free time. They can develop their creativity and peer relationship. But this type of socialization just happens to be less fruitful in modern economies, where skills and tertiary education, academic skills and tertiary education tend to be very important. In economics, there is a slightly different angle on it, but it's related. So there, it's more about investing in children's education and health, both via socialization and reading to children, helping them learn, and how whatever children learn at a young age is an absolute bedrock for what they're going to learn at older ages. So James Heckman has a Nobel Prize for some of the work on this, but all of it leads to what happened during the pandemic in Ireland, and how did children from different families cope with online learning? So this is one of my recent projects, and this is rooted entirely in the family investment model. So data were collected in the summer of 2020, right after 8 and 9-year-olds or 9-10-year-olds completed their first term of online education, which came as a surprise to them and the parents and the teachers and the principals, because if you remember, the transition to remote schooling happened very abruptly, and no one was really prepared for this. So there is a measure of children's engagement with remote schooling, which is largely about how much they like it. It's adapted from a similar scale used for a regular face-to-face teaching. We have some measures of what the families have. Now, the questions are posed to young children, so at best they can say how many cars, computers may be difficult, and how many family holidays they go on. But there are also really good questions about what kind of technology the children had access to for their remote learning, whether it's a computer or some kind of smartphone or tablet. And also whether they felt that they could get help with their remote work if needed, and if their work was checked by a teacher. So I'll just get straight to the results. Well, it turns out that whatever children were saying about how many cars and how many holidays they had access to, that didn't actually matter in the great scheme of things. What mattered was whether you have a laptop or a computer for remote work, whether your work was checked by a teacher, and whether you had some help within your family. It was But the thing that is quite troubling is that the children who had inattention or hyperactivity, they engaged with online learning to a lesser extent, and they also engaged with regular face-to-face schooling the year before to a lesser extent. So these two things kind of canceled each other out in the final model, but there is evidence that children who have hyperactivity or inattention, as assessed by the teacher the year before COVID, they struggled with remote learning, and it is entirely in line with the evidence we have from other studies recently that say that children with special educational needs and neurodiversity did struggle more than others. So having the right technology for remote learning at home mattered a lot. Having access to help from teachers and parents mattered. Girls did better than boys, but while it's a reasonably large difference by gender, it's kind of very uncertain. So it's just sort of barely makes it to through the statistical significance thresholds. But there is some evidence that maybe girls coped a little bit better than boys. So to conclude, yes, there are huge socioeconomic differences at all ages in children's educational achievement and attainment. But there is a way to reduce these inequalities. We can learn from countries that tend to have better policies in a sense that they do make these inequalities smaller and the gaps narrower. If a country is not able to make sure that everybody has enough money to live on, then they could invest in services so that the effects of income differences between families do not affect children as much. So make sure that enrichment activities are accessible and available, that schooling and healthcare are free at the point of delivery. And of course, focus on not just the average performance, say in PISA tests, but also look at how these scores are distributed and whether you have a lot of children falling behind their peers on any measure. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
I will take questions if there are any. I do have one. Keep things going if you don't. If you can, please ask you to repeat the question just for the audience afterwards, like online. So my question would be, we know a lot, and as you said already, like this is a topic that just comes every once in a while in newspapers as well. Like it's been known, it is known. Some countries have moved towards some solutions, so there are already also examples like that we could be learning from, as you said. Why some other countries are not implementing those or not moving towards it? Like, is it because it's cultural, just not paying attention? Is it a matter of resources, like a combination?
Thank you. That's really kind of a million dollar question. So should I repeat the question?
Yeah, just short it.
So if there are some countries that seem to do a better job of it, why are other countries not learning from them? You know, why? You should really talk to politicians about that. I think, well, cultural reasons are important, historical reasons are important, the way that there are different interests that are, you know, equally valid and all competing for attention and the same resources. I think it is important to keep on bringing up international differences, and you know, if there are certain countries, say in Scandinavia, that seem to do something really well, we should be bringing it up and saying, well, we can also achieve that. I mean, not necessarily using the exact same means, the same policies. You can't just borrow policies without paying attention to the context, but at least we can aspire to have, say, the entire compulsory schooling cycle truly free for all children, so that how much money their parents earn wouldn't matter at all ultimately, and so that the quality of these schools also would not differ by, say, how privileged the area in which they live. So if you aspire to that and you work towards that slowly but surely, I think eventually it will happen.
That's great. Thank you.
Do you think there's also, apart from the policy perspective, there also needs to be education for parents? Like some parents from Middle East, for example, would be okay with all these influences, and they'd be like, okay, we have more money. So they wouldn't even care about these differences, but at the end of the day, these do affect the society in which your children are going to go. So would you suggest also changing the mindset of the parents from how inequality would affect the whole society?
Oh, this is such an amazing question, and I think about it a lot as well. So the question is whether there's also something to be said for the parents and their perceptions and sort of ideology around these things, because some parents may actually be quite okay with inequality. So I think we now have enough theory and evidence to be absolutely sure that most parents will prioritize their own children over those of others. They will do whatever they can to get their children to the best school, get them the best tutors, do whatever they can to the utmost of their ability and financial resources. So while it is important to engage with the society and talk to everyone and convince everyone, I think ultimately this is where you really have this tension between the public good and the personal motivation. So the best thing to do, I think, is to make sure that all of, say all the schools are equally good, and then parents do not have to worry so much about where they send their children. And so that even those who do slightly less well than others, say children on standardized tests, even those children have achieved high levels of competencies and can then take those to the labor market and further study and so on and so forth. So bring up the minimum for everyone, reduce the gaps, and don't just count on parents to do something that will disadvantage their own children, because chances are that's not really going to happen. But it's such an important thing to think about.
I have two questions from the online participants. So Ian asked, are there some simple investments like funds, bonds, etc. that we have?
Phones?
Funds.
Oh, funds. Investments in what? I'm not entirely sure what the context is. So investments into
It's like financial investments, I presume. Into solving inequalities.
so just on the higher government level. I mean,
Long investments, he said.
I mean, yes, I think all of these would have to be long investments, both in teacher training and infrastructure. Well, those two would be quite important when we're talking about education, teachers and infrastructure. So suddenly there are no extremely quick fixes necessarily. But yes, if we spend more money on education, then you could argue we have less money for health. So these are the sort of things that politicians and ministers have to grapple with. Thank you.
Another question from Srimata, who asks, do you believe that the mindset of students are changed due to the online classes during this COVID period?
Thank you. So the question is whether the mindset of children has changed due to the online COVID period. So I can only speak based on this Children's School Lives project that I was involved in terms of accessing the data and writing a paper. I am not necessarily aware yet from the data of any specific changes. Certainly plenty of children were still highly engaged with online learning, as in they really liked it, they looked forward to it, and those were primary school children. I think this may differ for university students, for example. But I think we still need to collect more data and understand better what actually happened over the past 2 years and counting, and indeed, including how perceptions and attitudes of children and young people have changed.
Questions? No? Then I actually have one last one, quick one. We're at the university, and you talked about investments on teachers. What could professors at the university level do? And if they can do something, or is it too late because it's like at the end of the spectrum? Like,
okay, so what can university professors do? So to reduce inequalities due to COVID?
Not just COVID, just general education inequalities, inequalities, as you said before, you know, like for example, based on socioeconomic studies or.
I mean, well, I suppose if it comes to the way that we interact with our students, I think it often does come across towards the end of the term when students start asking for extensions. For example, a lot of these extensions have to do with childcare or other caring responsibilities or employment, because a lot of students have to work during their studies, and that does tend to impact on their schoolwork, at least somewhat. So I think those of us who teach here are aware of all of these struggles and differences. And I think especially during the pandemic, I think we have been lenient with granting extensions, but I don't know of any initiatives that would be very far-reaching that would necessarily help all the students. Now, there are schemes for bringing students into Trinity, but they are somewhat different, and it's not enough to just get students into a place like Trinity. You also have to support them, because if you don't support them, that some of them will struggle, and then we shouldn't let them struggle. We should actually give them all the supports that they need, and but that is hard. So, because we also need supports for giving the students all the supports that we need. Thanks.
That is very true. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting conversation and discussion. Okay, so now for the big reveal. So I'll just show you all the shortlisted photos once. So we have life in the rice mill, bed and table, fire incident, and limitations. And the winner of the Unprivileged 2022 contest is fire incident. Yay! So congratulations to the photographer for this amazing photo. And just 2 words on why this was chosen. So the judges panel felt that, first of all, this has an amazing photographic techniques and it's very visually impactful, but also it captured an important inequality in an original way, because it was probably the only one related to environmental safety and health, related to like the right to be healthy and live in a healthy environment. And on top of that, we also felt that because of how it was composed, it actually kind of represented the inequalities in society in an abstract way, because the burnt and dark car in the center somehow generally could represent how these inequalities are right in the middle of us, even if the crowd around doesn't really care about it or doesn't acknowledge it. So congratulations to the winner, congratulations to all the photographers that participated, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thanks. I'll stop recording.